The river carried the sound of sorrow long before it carried the woman. It was late afternoon in the Windcaller Range, one of those quiet, bone-cold hours when even the mountains seemed to hold their breath. Elias Crow had spent 12 winters alone up here, living in a hand-built cabin tucked between the pines and the jagged stone. Silence had become a kind of companion to him. But on that day, the silence cracked. It started with a scream thin, distant, swallowed quickly by the roar of rushing water. Elias froze. His axe hung in midair, a log half-split beneath it. The river ran wild this time of year, fed by melting snow from the higher peaks. Nobody should have been near it, nobody but him. He dropped the axe, boots pounding across the forest floor as he ran toward the water. Branches slapped at his coat, snow crunched underfoot. The scream came again closer this time, raw with terror. Then he saw her. A woman in a torn, mud-soaked dress was clinging to a half-sunken log, spinning helplessly through the rapids. Her hair dark, long, tangled snapped around her face like a whip. Her eyes were wide, panicked, full of a fear that didn't belong to the river alone. Elias didn't think. He never did in moments like this. Instinct had carried him through wars and wilderness alike. It carried him now. He sprinted along the bank, matching her pace, searching for a break in the rocks. The river bent sharply ahead toward a drop he knew too well. If she reached it, the mountain would swallow her whole. "Hold on!" he roared, though the wind stole half the words. She didn't answer. She was slipping. Her fingers loosened. The log jerked sideways. She gasped as icy water swallowed her head. Elias leapt. The shock of cold knifed through him instantly, but he pushed forward, muscles burning, boots dragging like anchors. The current churned and spun him, but he forced himself toward the thrashing figure just ahead. Her hand surfaced small, shaking. He grabbed her wrist. For a moment the river fought to keep her. But Elias was stronger. He pulled her close, wrapped an arm around her waist, and kicked hard toward the rocks near the bank. His lungs screamed. She coughed violently, water spilling from her lips. "You're all right," he rasped between strokes. "I've got you." In truth, he didn't know if he had her. The current slammed them into a boulder, scraping his shoulder raw. He held her tighter. She clung to him, shaking so hard her teeth clicked. Finally, with one last push, he shoved her toward a jagged outcrop and dragged both of them onto solid ground. The two collapsed onto the cold mud, soaked and gasping. For several seconds, neither spoke. Only the river did roaring past, impatient for the next thing it might claim. Elias rolled onto his knees, breath heavy. The woman beside him trembled violently, hugging her arms to her chest. "You're safe now," he said quietly. Her eyes opened slowly deep brown, glassy with cold and terror. She stared at him as if she wasn't sure whether he was real. Thank you," she whispered, voice cracking like thawing ice. He nodded, rising carefully. "Can you stand?" she tried. Her legs buckled instantly. Elias caught her before she hit the ground. "You're freezing through," he said. "We need to get you by a fire before your blood turns to stone." She hesitated, studying him. Why help me?" He frowned at the question. Because help was needed. Something in her gaze softened, just a little. Almost like she hadn't expected that answer. He lifted her into his arms, and she let her head fall against his shoulder as he carried her up the trail toward his cabin. Her breath shivered against him. She was light, far too light for someone who'd likely been running through the wilderness. Elias's cabin waited ahead, smoke curling from the chimney. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried her inside. The room was warm, lit by a crackling fire and the faint glow of evening sun through the window. He set her gently near the hearth. "Sit close. I'll find you something dry." She watched him move, watched him rummage through a chest for blankets and clothes. Watched him stoke the fire higher, watched the snow melt from his coat onto the wooden floor. There was a weight in her stare, something haunted, something wary. When he handed her a wool blanket, she wrapped it around herself with trembling hands. Her lips were still blue. "What's your name?" Elias asked. She swallowed. "Lydia." He nodded. "Elias." The fire hissed softly between them. A storm of silence followed. Finally, Lydia whispered, "There were men hunting me." Elias straightened. "Why?" She looked toward the window, as if expecting shadows to be moving outside. "I saw something I shouldn't have. Something they'd killed to keep buried." He waited, letting her choose the pace. I was traveling with a wagon group, she continued, voice low. We stopped near a mining town 2 days ago. That night, I heard 2 men talking behind a saloon. They were arguing about something they'd done, something awful. And then one of them said my name. I hadn't told it to anyone. Her hands tightened around the blanket. They came for me before dawn. Elias felt a coldness unrelated to the river settle into his bones. And you ran. She nodded. I ran until I reached the river. I hoped they wouldn't follow me up here. Elias exhaled slowly. He'd lived long enough on the frontier to know one truth. Nobody hunted a woman this far into the mountains unless they meant to finish the job. The fire crackled. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the shutters. Then Lydia suddenly reached for his sleeve. Her fingers were cold, urgent, trembling. Elias? She whispered. If they find me here, they'll kill you too. He held her gaze steady, unshaken. Let them try, he said quietly. But Lydia didn't look reassured. Her eyes drifted toward the window again, wide with a fear that still had a pulse. Elias? She whispered, voice breaking. I didn't just see something. I overheard the name of a man they planned to kill next. His brow tightened. Who? Her lips parted. Before she could answer, the front window shattered, exploding inward with a violent crash. A bullet tore through the room, and Lydia screamed. Thank you for watching. If you want to know what happens next, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on part 2. We'll see you then. The gunshot split the cabin air like lightning. Elias reacted before thought could form. He lunged toward Lydia, knocking her flat against the floorboards as a second bullet punched through the wall above them, splintering wood across their backs. Stay down, he breathed. The room filled with dust and smoke from the shattered glass. The fire snapped sharply, scattering sparks across the stone hearth. Outside, boots crunched in the snow, deliberate, slow, confident. They weren't hiding. They wanted him to know they were here. Lydia clutched his coat sleeve, her whole body trembling. Elias, I'm so sorry. Quiet now, he murmured. Save your breath. He slid an arm beneath her, helping her crawl behind a heavy oak table. Another bullet tore through the far window. The men were circling. Elias rose into a crouch, moving to the rifle propped near the hearth. He chambered around with a smooth, practiced motion. Years alone in the mountains had carved a quiet skill into him, one that now woke like an old wolf. Lydia watched him with terror and awe mingled in her gaze. They won't stop, she whispered. Not until he cut her off with a single look. They picked the wrong cabin. The footsteps outside stopped. Silence settled thick, unnatural. Elias angled himself by the broken window, keeping his shadow low. Snow drifted into the cabin in thin flakes. The sun had fallen completely now, leaving the forest cloaked in deep indigo. Lydia, he said without looking back, finish what you were trying to tell me. Whose name did you overhear? She hesitated, breath shaking. It was yours. Elias turned sharply. Mine? She nodded, eyes wide. I didn't understand at first, but the men in the alley... They were talking about eliminating someone who'd been nosing around the wrong shipments. Someone who lived on the mountain. A man named Elias Crow. The river's roar outside felt suddenly far away. Elias stared at her, at the fear in her face, the sincerity trembling in her voice. I haven't been near a mining town in years, he said slowly. I keep to myself. Speak to no one. That's why they're afraid of you, she whispered. Because you live close to the ridge where they've been moving things in the dark. They think you've seen too much. He pressed his back against the wall, processing. I've seen lights in the valley some nights. Wagons moving when wagons shouldn't move. I paid them no mind, but they paid mind to you, Lydia said. They think you're a threat. Elias looked toward the door, jaw tightening. And they're planning to end it tonight. A voice outside cut through the wood like a knife. Crow, we know you've got the girl. Hand her over, and maybe we'll leave your corpse in one piece. Lydia flinched. Elias's grip on the rifle tightened. You don't have to protect me, she whispered. You owe me nothing, he turned to her. I saved you from that river because it was right. And I'll keep saving you until this ends. Her eyes glistened, not with fear this time, but something softer. The voice outside growled again. We ain't asking twice. Elias moved toward the door. Stay hidden, he told her. Elias, don't go out there. He put a finger to his lips. She fell silent. He cracked the door open just enough to see the dark silhouettes of 3 men fanned out across the snow-covered clearing. Lantern light glowed faintly behind them from their wagon. The men weren't bandits. They were organized, boots polished, coats heavy, guns gleaming, hired killers. Elias stepped back, thinking fast. He couldn't take them all in the open. But he didn't need to. He grabbed the iron poker from near the fire and held it over the flames. It heated instantly, glowing red. Lydia watched with confusion. What are you? He didn't answer. He carried the burning poker to the back wall and dragged it across a narrow strip of pine logs. The wood sizzled. Smoke curled up. Then a whisper of flame. Lydia's eyes widened. You're setting your own cabin on fire? Smoke will force them to make a mistake, he said. And mistakes are how we live tonight. The fire spread quickly. He knew it would. This cabin had kept him safe for a dozen winters, but now it would serve one last purpose. He tossed the poker aside and moved to the back window. Stay right behind me, he said. We have to reach the tree line. Before Lydia could respond, the roof creaked above them as smoke filled the room. A shadow darkened the doorway. The men outside had seen the glow. Shouting erupted. Crow's burning it! Don't let him escape! Elias smashed open the back window with the butt of his rifle. Cold air rushed in. He helped Lydia through first, then climbed out after her, just as a bullet ripped through the cabin behind his head. They sprinted into the trees. Lydia stumbled, breath ragged. Elias steadied her, pulling her along the narrow path he knew by heart. The forest swallowed them in seconds. Behind them, the cabin burned brighter and brighter embers rising like fireflies into the night. The men cursed and fired blindly into the woods. Keep moving, Elias urged. Lydia's legs shook from exhaustion and cold, but she pressed on, leaning into him as they climbed higher through the pines. Snow whispered beneath their boots. Owls scattered overhead. Every breath formed thin clouds in the freezing air. Finally, Elias pulled her behind a fallen cedar, lowering her gently to the ground. She coughed hard, lungs burning, tears streaking down her mud-stained cheeks. I didn't mean to bring this to you. Elias knelt beside her, watching the orange glow of his burning cabin flicker through the trees. You didn't bring this to me, he said quietly. They were coming either way. She looked up at him, confused. He met her gaze. I suspect the truth is deeper than either of us knows. Then a twig snapped, close, too close. Elias swung his rifle toward the sound, finger on the trigger. A shadow stepped into view, not one of the killers. This man was older, dressed in a long coat dusted with snow, a rifle slung over his shoulder, and a face Elias recognized even in the dark. Lydia gasped. Do you know him? Elias's voice dropped, heavy and stunned. Yes, I do. The man stepped forward, eyes sharp, voice low. Elias? You need to listen carefully. Those men won't stop. And Lydia isn't just running from murderers. He looked directly at her. She's running from the man who hired them. Lydia's breath caught. No, please don't. Elias rose slowly, heart pounding. Who hired them? The old man swallowed, and then he spoke a name that froze the wind itself. Your brother, Elias. Lydia covered her mouth in shock. Elias staggered back, as if struck. Don't miss the stunning conclusion. Subscribe and turn on notifications for part 3. For a long moment, Elias Crow couldn't hear the burning cabin behind him, or the wind roaring through the pines, or even the beat of his own heart. All he heard was a name. A name he had buried 12 long years ago. His brother. Jonas Preisold, weathered snow in his beard, stood in the moonlit clearing like a man carrying a storm on his shoulders. Lydia trembled beside the dying fire, clutching a blanket around her. Elias, she whispered. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. But Elias barely heard her. His gaze was locked on Jonas. What do you mean? He said quietly, his voice dangerously low. That my brother sent armed men into my mountains? Jonas stepped forward, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. Isaac isn't the same boy you left behind. He runs the mining shipments now. And some of those shipments, they aren't just ore. Elias's jaw tightened. Guns? Jonas shook his head, his expression grim. Bodies, cover-ups, dead miners buried in the shafts. He's selling land rights illegally, and killing off the men who know the truth. Lydia nodded shakily, her voice barely a whisper. I overheard them. They were planning to kill the last witness, a sick young miner who had escaped. And then, they saw me. Silence fell across the clearing, heavy and cold like fresh snow. Elias, he's selling land rights illegally, and killing off the men who know the truth. Lydia nodded shakily, her voice barely a whisper. I overheard them. They were planning to kill the last witness, a sick young miner who had escaped. And then, they saw me. Silence fell across the clearing, heavy and cold like fresh snow. Elias looked down at the ground. Silence fell across the clearing, heavy and cold like fresh snow. Elias looked down at the ground, the flakes melting on his dark lashes. Isaac, his little brother, the last of his family. The one he had left behind to keep safe. Now the most dangerous man in the valley. How many did he send after her? Elias asked finally, his voice raw. 3 tonight, Jonas said. More will come, Lydia's voice cracked with fear. We have to run, no. Elias's voice was firm, unyielding. Running ends nothing. He turned his gaze toward the valley, toward the ranch he hadn't seen since their father died. He checked his rifle, its cold steel familiar in his grip, and strode into the darkness without a backward glance. He was going home. The moon hung low as Elias descended the rugged ridge. The world below looked peaceful silver fields, quiet barns, smoke curling from chimneys, a perfect picture. But he knew better. Peace is a glass thing, beautiful and so easy to break. This valley, his home, was broken, and he was the only one who could piece it back together. By dawn, Elias reached the valley floor. The old Crow Ranch rose from the frost like a memory carved in wood. He remembered building that fence with his father, chasing Isaac through that very field. Now the barn door stood slightly ajar. Light flickered inside, and a familiar voice, a voice he hadn't heard in 12 years, echoed from the shadows. Elias took a steadying breath and stepped in. The old Crow Ranch rose from the frost like a memory carved in wood. He remembered building that fence with his father, chasing Isaac through that very field. Now the barn door stood slightly ajar. Light flickered inside, and a familiar voice, a voice he hadn't heard in 12 years, echoed from the shadows. Elias took a steadying breath and stepped in. Isaac Crow stood surrounded by crates stacked high to the rafters. Was she supposed to drown in that river? Was she supposed to drown in that river? A flash of guilt crossed Isaac's face, but only for a moment. He quickly buried it under a wave of defiance. Only for a moment. He quickly buried it under a wave of defiance. You don't understand, he snapped. I've built something here. Something that keeps this valley alive. Built something here. Something that keeps this valley alive. You've built it on graves, Elias said, his words soft but sharp as a razor. Isaac froze. The barn settled into a tense silence, the old rafters creaking above them as if holding their breath. Was she supposed to drown in that river? A flash of guilt crossed Isaac's face, but only for a moment. He quickly buried it under a wave of defiance. You don't understand, he snapped. I've built something here. Something that keeps this valley alive. You've built it on graves, Elias said, his words soft but sharp as a razor. Isaac froze. The barn settled into a tense silence, the old rafters creaking above them as if holding their breath. Elias moved like a shadow from the war-silent, precise, deadly. He fired once, disarming the lead gunman with a shot that sent his rifle flying. Isaac ducked behind crates, pure panic in his eyes. He was a businessman, not a fighter. One attacker charged, a wild look on his face. Elias rolled behind a wooden wagon and fired again. A second man dropped. The third raised his rifle, aiming straight for Elias. Bang! Elias moved like a shadow from the war-silent, precise, deadly. He fired once, disarming the lead gunman with a shot that sent his rifle flying. Isaac ducked behind crates, pure panic in his eyes. He was a businessman, not a fighter. One attacker charged, a wild look on his face. Elias rolled behind a wooden wagon and fired again. A second man dropped. The third raised his rifle, aiming straight for Elias. Bang! You're my brother, Elias whispered, the words heavy with everything left unsaid between them. Isaac collapsed to his knees, the rifle clattering to the floor. The weight of his actions finally crushed him. I didn't mean for any of this. I lost myself, Elias. I lost everything I was. Elias knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Then we rebuild it. Together. but you tell the truth. You face justice. You end this with me. Isaac bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with sobs. I will, and for the first time in 12 long years. Elias believed him. A month later, winter began its slow melt across Sandridge Valley. The truth had come out, washing through the town like the spring thaw. Isaac Crow was now in federal custody, alive, repentant, and finally paying for his sins. Jonas Price returned to his quiet life of ranch work. The storm finally passed. And Elias? I will, and for the first time in 12 long years. Elias believed him. A month later, winter began its slow melt across Sandridge Valley. The truth had come out, washing through the town like the spring thaw. Isaac Crow was now in federal custody, alive, repentant, and finally paying for his sins. Jonas Price returned to his quiet life of ranch work. The storm finally passed. And Elias? He stood on the porch of a newly built cabin deep in the mountains. Anywhere doesn't matter, he said softly. If you have no one to share it with. Her fingers slipped into his, a simple touch that meant everything. A smile warmed her face. Then I suppose you'd better stay right here. He turned to her, the woman he had saved from the river. The woman whose past nearly destroyed him. The woman who gave him a future again. Elias squeezed her hand, his heart full. Lydia, he murmured, for the first time in years. The world feels right. She leaned her head on his shoulder. And as the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley, Elias Crow finally felt something he never thought he'd have again: home.